Welcome everyone. This is a summary presentation of the lectorial that was on September 13. Now unfortunately the recording was messed up, and so today we're replacing that with a summary. It's going to be a case study of looking at biopower, affect, and we're going to start it with a case study around two particular aspects of what the theorist Esposito would call immunitas. I'm starting off with some vision here from a radio station podcast called for 3RRR. The reason why is because I was on a discussion panel with them a couple of weeks ago, and on the panel were three people: myself, Jack Nagle, who is a reformed drug user and used to be a very elite basketballer. The other person on the panel was a guy called Nico Clark, and he's the manager of Melbourne's new supervised injecting facility. Now, the three of us were on the panel to talk about the issue of drugs, but it was a particularly opportune one because here was a demonstration of two aspects of biopower that the theorist Esposito brought together. On the one hand, biopower is a pernicious, powerful force for creating bare life for individuals who are unproductive. But on the other hand, it exposed an aspect of biopower which was actually much more about being inclusive, and what Esposito would call communitas, which is a term that coexists with his other term, which is called immunitas. Now, I'm going to start with the, this is a summary, so I'm going to go through it fairly quickly. I'm going to start with the work of Jack Nagle. Now, Jack Nagle was a elite basketballer who played with Andrew Gaze, and he fell off the rails. He came under hard times. He started using ice, had some significant mental health issues. And I'm focusing on this part of the story because now he's a reformed drug user. He doesn't use drugs anymore. He says he's been clean for quite some time. And what I will use his case illustration for is how there is an application of biopower that extends beyond the kind of category of social behaviour that is what we would assume currently a risk behaviour. Here's an extension of biopower into the life of this guy, Jack Nagle, because he used to be a drug user. Now, this is really important in terms of understanding how biopower is deployed. We usually think about it as a way of segmenting the society into giving opportunities to those people who are productive and who discipline themselves, who actually respond to disciplinary power. Whilst at the same time responding to those people in a positive way who are happy with the deployment of disciplinary power, we actually also then subjugate those people who are not happy to comply with disciplinary power. And instead what we do is we deploy biopower. Now, biopower is applied across the population, doesn't get exerted upon the individual. So here I'm using Jack Nagle as a kind of illustration of what happens to this category of people who are ex-drug users. Now, the reason why I'm focusing on this is because we usually think about biopower as only really being exerted upon those segments of the population who pose an immediate risk. So it's pretty easy to think of criminals, drug users, people who pose a significant and imminent threat to the body politic. Now, here we use the example of Jack Nagle because, in a sense, he shouldn't pose any risk. But what I noted recently was a mechanism through which organisations actually still extend a kind of mechanism to deploy biopower on drug users even after they've finished using drugs. And the reason why this became apparent is because I coach basketball, and I received a request from the basketball club that I am a member of, and the request was to sign a statutory declaration that affirmed that I was of minimal risk to the players I was coaching. So here it is. It's called the Member Protection Declaration. Now this came from Basketball Victoria as part of their child safety guidelines that have emerged in a number of different organisations as a response to the Royal Commission into the institutional responses to child sexual abuse. Now this Child Member Protection Declaration requires everyone who works with children, so this is beyond the child, safety checks that you do. This is an additional statutory declaration that says you've never been charged with any criminal offence relating to child sexual abuse, but more importantly, it's a net widening. It actually relates to any conduct related to narcotics or violence. So you have to assert whether you've been found guilty of an offence relating to narcotics or violence, but also that you shouldn't have been suspended or dismissed from a position in sport, a volunteer organisation, business, educational or other government or semi-government organisation where that rejection was based on your conduct in relation to violence or drug use. So it's very much a net widening technique to actually ensure that well, not only that you're currently engaged, but that you had never previously been engaged in behaviour that could pose a risk to children. So this is an example of how we deploy. So by actually stopping people participating in such a thing as a very banal thing as being able to coach a basketball team. Now this became apparent to me because in the panel discussion where Jack Nagle was there, I became aware that actually here's a guy who was actually had played at a very, very high level, was a very, very competent person, but because of his previous behaviour wasn't able to engage in what might be what some people would think is be a very simple contribution to society. So this was a kind of exclusionary practice to actually stop him participating in society. So in this case, we'd actually think of people like, that is, people who are ex-drug users as somehow being subject to biopower. Now again, this is reflected in the work of Basketball Victoria. It's not just about this club, and so it's actually something that's been produced by the state. After that discussion, we actually went on to actually talk about why this might be important in terms of how we think about the deployment of biopower. And one of the things that I wanted to emphasise was the connection between how these mechanisms of exclusion work in relation to affect. And this is important because often these mechanisms through which we exclude people are on the basis of how they pose a risk, and this risk, as we know from the work of Durkheim, has often been symbolic. And if it's symbolic, then it obviously connects up to how we think about emotions and affect. We'd previously been talking about affect in terms of sentencing and in terms of the importance of of affect in structuring things like how we determine social order. In this particular thinking about affect, we're going to think about it a little bit differently according to the work of Sarah Ahmed, where she talks about emotions that are not just the product of an individual's feelings, but emotions actually connect individual and collective bodies. They're mobile and they circulate between bodies and signs. They delineate the boundaries between different types of bodies. Some bodies make you feel comfortable, some bodies disgust you. Some bodies make you feel sick, some bodies actually put you off. What she also says is that emotions actually produce the ordinary. They make us think that some things are ordinary and some things are abnormal, and that emotion animates normal objects to being abnormal or to being superordinary. And that what's important about affect is that it actually they connect to objects. And it's this capacity for affect to move between and across, to slide between bodies and objects that constructs what she calls a relation of resemblance between the figures. So it makes them like or unlike. So in terms of people, we we find emotions that connect to people who are similar to us or not like us. So it connects up to the early work of Durkheim, but it's slightly different because the emotions, in a sense, are not connected to the individual. They move across. In particular, what it actually, Sarah Ahmed was interested in hate, and that hate does not necessarily reside in a given subject-object, that hate, in a sense, is economic. It circulates between signifiers in relations to difference and in relation to displacement. So, and in a sense, she talks about it as being economic because there's a kind of economy, an affectual economy. So some things that are valued because of their what emotions are connected to them, and that this can change over time. And that, it kind of makes sense. There are some things that we look at that some objects in our world that actually produce pleasure, that are valuable, and those things in the world that are actually displeasure, that actually scare us. And in this sense, this is the basis through which we exclude, this is the basis through which we actually deploy biopower. So the productive, it makes us feel good. The unproductive, that which threatens us, is actually that which we then make subject to biopower. So people like Jack Nagle actually have negative affect attached to them, and that this is not just a product of them, it's not an attribute of them, but it's actually a product of what we give them, what we attach to them as bodies and objects in the world. Emotions do things. They align individuals with communities or with bodily spaces or social spaces through the very intensity of their attachment. Emotions are mobile. They stick figures together through adherence. They create the very effect of a collective. They cohere. They actually make sense of the world. So examples of this are like the asylum seeker or the international terrorist. So again, this economic model of emotions suggests that while emotions do not positively reside in a subject or figure, they still work to bind subjects together. So this is in a way is actually getting us to connect up some of the theorists that we've talked about previously, and it gives us a kind of tool for thinking about how we actually construct those segments of society through which we want to deploy biopower. Emotion is central to this. Emotion is central to how we segment society according to those things that create risk, that create fear, and that those then become segments through which we exclude. We actually make them have a bare life. And it's often through the way we connect up emotions to those objects, to those bodies, that is the feature of the technique of deploying biopower. So in the next part, I actually go on and I start talking about Jack Nagle again. And the reason why is because here we've got something from Basketball Victoria which says we need to exclude this category of people who have been involved in child sexual abuse, or people who have been involved in violence, or people who have been involved in the use of narcotics. So then we return back to Jack Nagle and we say, well, look, is he the sort of figure that we attach negative emotion to? And we looked at some of the symbolism attached to his website. He's a public speaker. He speaks. He's what they call a recovery advocate, someone who advocates for people to give up drugs. And he tells his story of suffering and mental distress and suicide, and talks about his journey of how he rediscovered himself outside of drugs. So he's appeared on television interviews. He's a good-looking guy. He's tall. He's strong. He's a kind of clean-cut sort of figure. So he's not the sort of figure you would usually attach negative emotion to. So we really wonder why it is and how it is that we actually attach these emotions to this kind of figure who, for all intents and purposes, looks quite not the sort of person that you'd actually want to exclude. But somehow we attach, by virtue of his history of offending, we attach a bunch of negative emotions which allow us, through this institutionalization of emotional economy or affectual economy, this institutionalization through such a simple thing as requiring a sporting club to the coaches in that sporting club to sign a statutory declaration, this is how we deploy biopower, in such simple things that the state requires clubs to actually get an assurance from the coaching staff of their history of behaviour and history of offending behaviour. So this is the nitty-gritty. This is how we deploy biopower. So I thought this was a great example. The reason why it's also good is because this was happening on in the one episode, like on a Saturday night on a radio show between midnight and 2 a.m. Not many people listening, but it was actually quite an important one. Because here was an example of Jack Nagle, a subject of biopower, a reformed drug user, in the same room talking about the same issues as the manager of a supervised injecting facility, which is Nico Clark, and we'll come back to him a bit later. But we'll stick with Jack Nagle because we might do a bit of we did a wisdom of the crowd exercise. And in this case, what we did was to ask the question, should Jack Nagle be allowed to coach basketball? So let's ask the people in the room what they think. So we could ask a number of different questions, and that's what we did over the next 35 minutes, 40 minutes. In the summary, it'll probably only go for another 12 minutes, but we'll look at some of the questions that I asked, and then we also had questions that people in the room asked. So the first question was, should Jack Nagle be allowed to coach basketball? So of course we went to our wisdom of the crowd, we got our devices out, went to quick poll, and what did we find? Well, we found that we first asked the question, should he be allowed to coach? And what we found was a kind of very interesting response. We found that there was a very strong response that says, yes, he should be allowed to coach basketball. A was yes, and I think B was no, and so we'll just ask it as a binary question. So part of this task was also get to be in a bit of practice about how we ask questions when we poll. And we actually come up a little bit later about, well, if we ask the question a little bit differently, then we get quite a different response. In the first instance, asking a binary question, should Jack Nagle be allowed to coach basketball, it actually is a very abstract question. It's a question in the abstract. It's not asking you for your personal experience or asking about how you personally believe somebody should coach your children. So what were the results there? Well, yes or no, we had 13, with 13 people voting, we had the vast majority saying that Jack should be allowed to coach basketball, yes. Now this was really interesting because this is a kind of somewhat would be contradictory to what Basketball Victoria is suggesting, who are actually saying no, someone like Jack should not be allowed to coach basketball. Sure, there's only 13 people in the sample, but it's a pretty strong message. A little later on we actually ask a different kind of question, but it actually poses a dilemma for us when we sort of have a situation like this where institutionally the government says, well, because of our governance over sport, we are allowed to actually create conditions through which people can participate in the community, such as coaches who have a history of offending. So what happens though when the public says, well, we actually disagree with that? What happens to the people in the room, those 11 people out of 13 who say, yeah, we think Jack should be allowed to coach? What should they do? What can they do in this situation? Well, the people could lie. The club could actually say, we refuse to actually ask our coaches these questions, but that might put their funding at risk. So there are the mechanisms through which the state can actually regulate the conduct of its citizens in terms of the way it can actually create a bare life. And in this case, this could seriously be creating a bare life for someone like Jack Nagle. Jack Nagle was an elite basketballer. He would quite, within his skill set, and he's a charismatic talker, this would be well within his skill set to be able to coach at a very, very high level. So in a sense, we're actually excluding him from economic from an economic life as much as a bare life. Where actually has very material effects in terms of the outcomes from the deployment of biopower. So this is why we say biopower is a really powerful way to control the population. If Jack Nagle can't create an income, then his capacity to actually do well in life is reduced to a very much a great extent. But also we had a discussion about what it meant about in some of the other categories that were excluded by Basketball Victoria. So those who had engaged in violence or those who were engaged in child sexual abuse. Now we probably think that that's reasonable that we restrict people who have been engaged in child sexual abuse from working with children. What about those people who have been subject to an apprehended violence order? So in the current context where, probably 50% of marriages end up in contested hearings or at least settlements of divorce hearings, then there is a high number of people who actually have orders as part of the to's and fro of family conflict in terms of managing the relationships and the ending up of relationships in those settings, that there would be a segment of the population who are subject to AVIs. Now, the way the Basketball Victoria's Declaration was worded was that actually you didn't actually have to be subject to an AVO. It's just as if somebody had sought an AVO against you. So it was a very wide, what they call a wide net. And so this was obviously some of our discussion was talking about, well, what's the, how do we feel about having such a wide net? There were people in the room who absolutely said, yep, no, we don't want people like that coaching our kids. So this is an example now of where I asked the people in the room, well, what other questions could we ask? And so somebody found a great question, which was, should Jack Nabel be allowed to coach your child? And in which case we had a similar kind of profile. 7 people said yes, 1 person said no. So we're actually saying that even though it was not put into the abstract, when it became a much more personal question about should Jack Nabel be able to coach your child, there was still quite a strong yes to allowing him to participate in social life. We then changed the language again. So in this case, instead of referring to Jack Nagel, and instead of referring to drug use or reformed drug user, we then changed the sentence with the question again, and in this case we wanted to talk about the abstract any coach, and what if they were a reformed sex offender? Would we be prepared to allow them to coach our children? So in this case, we asked the question, A, yes, B, no. So what would we anticipate? Now in this case, you would probably anticipate that, well, this is a different type of offender, this is a different type of crime, we should get a somewhat different response. And sure enough we did. We actually found that when we asked about a different type of offender, we got a very different response. Now the discussion was very much around, actually, this is not a reasonable comparison, because in a sense a reformed sex offender, the offence that they undertook was not what some people would call a victimless crime such as drug use, but in this case there was a victim to the crime, and in this case it's quite a serious offence. And so they're really comparing apples and pears here. That yes, people are not comfortable with a reformed sex offender coaching your child. So it was a very strong response in the opposite direction. So okay, so here we're having the attachment of affect to different types of offending bodies, and that produces obviously a very different response from the crowd. We then had quite an extended discussion about, well, how is it that attaching affect to bodies, how is that related back to immunitas? Well, immunitas is the capacity or the interest of the social body to protect itself. So in this case, what we're saying is the social body really does want to protect itself from the perceived threat, and that perceived threat is a body which has negative emotion attached to it. It doesn't actually have to be a threat that's actually current or imminent. It is actually just the disgust or the threat of this body which has these negative emotions attached to them. We also noted that actually this changes over time, that right now you can get arrested for a drug offence, which is, say, cannabis. In the United States now, there are a number of states where smoking cannabis is no longer a criminal offence. It actually is not punishable. It's actually legal to do, and in fact is taxed by the states. So the very notion that we can attach emotions to some bodies and not others is not just about the potential of the social body to change its vision, but it's in relation to the capacity of the state to change the parameters of where we attach disgust. So here we see this connection between the operation of the state, how it works to actually segment through the deployment of biopower, and we see that working through the deployment of negative affect. So here we see this connection. So this is the mechanics of biopower. And we use this way as a way of talking about the work of Roberto Esposito. Now, let's see where we go to next. So here, instead of asking the question of should a reformed drug user simply be allowed or not allowed to coach, we actually wanted to deepen the question a little bit. And in this case, we had a great discussion about, one, how you ask questions, but two, when you ask questions, how you can actually exclude some people by virtue of the type of question you ask. So in this case, the question wasn't should an ex-drug user be allowed to coach, a binary question. We wanted to change it to a different type of question. And in this case, we wanted to ask, well, what if we said, how many years should a drug user be reformed before they can coach basketball? A, less than a year, B, 2 years, C, 5 years, D, 7 years, or E, 10 years before they'd be allowed to coach basketball. So in this case, we're actually looking at sort of some gradation of fear associated with the amount of time that they've been clean. Now, what was noted in the room was that actually this type of question excludes two types of recipients. There is no way a person who actually believes that a person who actually thinks that coaches should be allowed to coach doesn't matter about whether they're a drug user or not. And so that person can't answer this question, or their views can't be heard in this type of question. Likewise, for those people who actually feel that anyone who's used a drug should never be allowed to coach, in which case their responses wouldn't be captured by this question. So here's a really good way of actually saying, well, what are we interested in here? Well, here we're interested in the middle ground. We're not interested in the two extremes of opinions. We're actually interested in those opinions which form a kind of middle ground of opinion or affect. So here we're actually using the question to segment the respondent pool as well. Anyway, so let's look at the results of this poll. We cut and pasted into quick poll, and let's create a new poll, put the comment in, update the comment, and we should start seeing some updated findings from that pretty soon. So again, A is less than a year, 2 years, 5 years, 7 years, 10 years, and here are the results, which were very interesting. We can see that the B category actually received the most amount of votes, which was a coach should be reformed for 2 years before they should be allowed to coach. So here we're actually getting a much more interesting spread of public opinion about the affect attached to reformed drug users. That not many people wanted a drug user to be coaching within a year of not using drugs. Most of them are more comfortable with either 2 years or 5 years being clean from drug use. What's interesting is that we get people at two extremes, small numbers at two extremes. There are still people who actually feel that a drug user doesn't matter how, they would need to be clean for 10 years before they would be allowed to coach basketball. So this is, I think, a really good exercise to demonstrate the way we can ask questions about affect and how we can actually both include and exclude different segments of the polled audience, and also how we can get into more detail about the nature of affect and how it is attached to body. So in this case, we're actually saying, listen, affect doesn't, if you take this, B and C categories seriously, you can actually say, well, actually, we don't feel as much distrust, or we don't feel as much disgust for reformed drug users, so long as they've been reformed for more than 2 years or 5 years. That those bodies shouldn't have that negative affect attached to them. Now, in a very simple sense, this kind of data, if we were to poll the community, we should give this to Basketball Victoria and say, hey, listen, maybe you should make your questions around the deployment of biopower more in line with what the wisdom of the crowd is thinking. So this is, again, a way of actually thinking in a very applied way about how we use the logic of biopower to change the way we organise public policy. Okay, so in the next section, the last section of the lectorial, we actually spent talking about communitas and immunitas. One of the things that is really interesting about Esposito is that he says that immunitas is that feeling of that impulse to actually protect us from that which threats the body politic. Communitas, on the other hand, is that which is a deployment of biopower which is actually more positive, which actually says that the social body requires us to be open, to actually not have borders, to actually allow everyone in, to actually say, listen, we don't care what characteristics you have or what negative emotions you have to us, everyone is welcome here. And he bases this on the etymological origins of the word community or communitas. That in a sense, instead of us being fearful that the reason why we actually allow participation with other members of society, it used to be with the Hobbesian view of the world, that the reason why we actually we cooperate with neighbours is that we actually are fearful for what would happen if we didn't. Now, Esposito actually believes that a better way to think about community, or this sense of openness in communitas, is that we are united by an obligation, that I live, and therefore in me living, I actually want you to live as well. And that by you and me living together, that we are of the same matter, we're of the same material, and that this is a kind of mutual obligation to life. What it also says is that actually in this version of biopower, the communitas, this communitas impulse, what it's interested in is actually that the community, the social body, thrives when it actually has open borders. But clearly there's a limit to that. Imagine if we were able to just open up the borders to everyone, to everything, to actually say, well, okay, you, the most threatening person in the community, yes, you're welcome here as well. Well, that won't work. So at the extremes of communitas is dysfunction. Likewise, at the extreme of immunitas, there is dysfunction. We talked about it previously as being an autoimmune disease where we misrecognize that which threatens us and we chop off elements of the social body just purely because we're fearful of it and not because it is actually a threat. So at the extremes of immunitas and communitas are dysfunction. So somewhere in the middle, there is a kind of way of actually through which we maintain immunity from that which threatens us, and community, we actually open up and welcome those to be part of the social body. So this welcoming aspect of communitas, it's an obligation to the other that binds us in a very, very important way. But that these two terms, immunitas and communitas, are not held in balance in a dialectical way. It's not hydraulic, that the more you have of one, the lesser you have of the other. And this is the really important so what of why Esposito is helpful. Is that Esposito is helpful because he relates immunitas and communitas as being coterminous, that they exist together, not necessarily in balance, but they coexist. So we can have some public policies that actually work in opposition to other social policies, but they don't necessarily negate them. As far as Esposito is concerned, the impetus or the drive for immunitas is actually coexistent with the drive for communitas, and that we can have policies in the same arena that actually are driven by different imperatives. They might work against each other, but they don't necessarily deplete each other. And this is actually why takes us back to the beginning of the lectorial, where we're having a panel where you've got two examples. You've got a supervised injecting facility where people are allowed, the government allows people, creates a space, in fact spends $1 million a year to allow people to do something illegal, i.e. to inject a drug, an illegal drug, in a legal space. Now this is an exemplar of communitas. It's saying, yes, you're doing something illegal, but we're going to allow you to be part of this space. We're going to protect you while you're doing it because you are part of our society. On the same panel on the Triple R Party show was Jack Nagle, who is here as someone who is fundamentally excluded from life, not because of his behaviour, but because of his past behaviour. So how do we make sense of this public policy setting when we've got two policies that mean two different things? One, an exemplar of communitas, and another one, an exemplar of the modern deployment of biopower, an exclusionary policy. So here, this is the so what for this complicated theory of Esposito. Esposito is good for policy situations where you have seemingly incompatible and contrasting policy imperatives. Here is a way of actually analysing a policy arena where you have the government supporting two things that seemingly don't make sense. Well, they do make sense. And it allows us to actually look across not just the fact that there might be a kind of simple utilitarian way of explaining it, i.e., oh, we have an ejecting room because this is a way to wedge the Green votes away from Labor in the run-up to an election, which may well be the case. Richmond is an area that is rapidly gentrifying, that has a high density of Green voters, and that perhaps the ALP put in the injecting room or allowed it to take place there because it would allow the ALP to gather those people who might actually be leaching over to the Green side of politics. Now that may well be the case. On the other hand, ALP is actually engaged in this kind of deployment of biopower, which is actually excluding people who, on the face of it, may well be just middle-class individuals. So you could actually approach this contrary and contrasting policy position as being just two separate instances of policy making. But this is the advantage of the Esposito, is Esposito allows us to connect up two seemingly disparate into a larger explanation for what might be two disjunctive and oppositional policy positions within the same public policy. Well, that's it. That's the summary of September 13 lectorial on immunitas. See you after the break.